she focused on the issue, but I do eagerly undertake her challenge. She says, you cannot make an argument that Hunter Biden is in contempt. How can you argue he will not come? She said, when he said he would come. Well, here's how. He was issued a subpoena for a deposition. He stated publicly and in correspondence that he would not testify in a deposition, that he wanted to do it his way in an open hearing. Well, that's contempt. And it is open and shut, cut and dried, as simple as it can possibly be. So the subject under debate is whether an ordinary citizen who defies a subpoena of a congressional impeachment inquiry should be held to account. And there is also no need, really, to debate that. Quite to the contrary from the suggestion of the gentlelady from California, the weight is all on the other side. And interestingly enough, in the matters of Bannon and Navarro, every member of the minority is on record to that effect. Indeed, members of the minority have gone farther than that. Mr. Raskin has specifically addressed the purported basis for objection that Hunter Biden has offered, stating that the proper course is to first have private testimony in a deposition to explore facts thoroughly and in the way that mode of examination permits, and then to have a public hearing after. Nobody that I can recall in the minority took issue with that point. But here's really the salient and final aspect that makes this clear beyond argument. This may be the most brazenly recalcitrant witness defying Congress in the history of the Congress that I'm aware of. Now, there may be some other situation in which this has been done. But the person who was subject to the subpoena, I hear the laughter on the other side, so let me go further. I don't know that anyone has ever come onto the complex in the shadow of the United States Capitol building, suborned and assisted by another member of Congress, a member of this committee, stood in the triangle and vowed to the media that he was defying the subpoena of a congressional impeachment inquiry. I don't know that that's ever been done. And I certainly don't believe that it's ever been the case that a member of Congress has made arrangements for that brazen defiance of Congress to be expressed on the Capitol, in the Capitol complex, on the plaza. So if you want to talk about the issue, it is not a close call. If you want to talk about what happened in the previous Congress and whether Congress can subpoena members of Congress to testify before a committee, especially when that committee has falsified and fabricated evidence to its eternal shame, then you can talk about those other issues. And I would if I were you, because you certainly cannot meet the simple proposition that is before us now.
Would the gentleman
certainly
yield?
Cannot deny the duty of this committee to respond to that brazen defiance.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
And I promise I'll yield back to you down the road. But the point I would just make here is that the difference between Hunter Biden and, as you mentioned, Navarro and Bannon, is that Navarro and Bannon totally stonewalled Congress. They didn't produce any documents. They didn't offer to testify in any way, and they didn't provide any testimony of any kind. By contrast here...
Let me take my time back, because I've only got another 20 seconds. And I don't want to just leave, and we'll come back to it and have further colloquy if you like. And I appreciate the gentleman from Maryland's collegial interaction. I think that is a distinction without a difference. I don't think, in fact, I think it makes it worse that Hunter Biden goes to media and declares and decides how he will testify to Congress. He will come to a public meeting, but he will not do what Congress has commanded by a lawful subpoena. I don't think it's a distinction that favors him. I think it's one that requires us to act. And my time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I appreciate the passion from my friend across the aisle and the outrage. I think we're all outraged about many things. But if we're going to talk about outrageous things that have happened or things that have never happened, let's talk about the fact that President Trump incited an erection. And maybe that too.
Yeah, you could talk about that too, I guess.
Maybe we should talk about that too. The president incited an insurrection. Maybe we should talk about the fact that the former president was impeached twice. Maybe we should talk about the fact that the former president was convicted on 91 felony counts. Maybe we should talk about the fact that the former president was charged with interfering with our elections. Maybe we should talk about the fact that most, if not all, of the members of this committee, certainly leaders in the House, have continued to support and endorse a person who has literally talked about being a dictator from day one. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe this markup is an unbelievable waste of time. My Republican colleagues have been investigating Hunter Biden for years. My colleague, Mr. Ivey, just gave very important statements about why this is a different case than others that have been cited. There's been no indication whatsoever that any of his activities are connected to the president. They have turned up nothing. So why are we really here today? It is another distraction from the fact that, in the words of one of my colleagues on the other side, in this committee, by the way, said on the floor of the House, this Republican-controlled do-nothing Congress has not delivered one thing that Republicans can go home and say that they delivered to their constituents. In fact, this Congress is on track to be one of the most unproductive in modern history. This Republican-led House has only passed 27 bills that became law in spite of holding 724 votes. We still have no reauthorization of the Farm Bill, no bringing to the floor of a bipartisan bill that we passed in this committee around surveillance reform. We are on the verge of a government shutdown, and you just compare that to 2022, when Democrats controlled the House with a razor-thin majority. We held 549 votes, and 248 bills were signed into law. Now, none of this inaction stops my Republican colleagues from celebrating all the funding for infrastructure and jobs that Democrats passed without a single Republican vote. Not a single Republican voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, and yet there are many that go home to their constituents and keep crowing about how they're bringing money home from bills that they never voted for. But aside from claiming the work of Democrats, Republicans have no achievements to run on. And the American people should make no mistake that this hearing is pure political distraction. My colleagues would have you forget that under the Biden administration, 2.7 million jobs were created just last year, more than any year under the previous administration. That is a total of 14.3 million jobs created under President Joe Biden. My colleagues would have you forget that starting this month, more Americans with diabetes will finally see sharp decreases in insulin prices. Thanks to President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, people on Medicare now pay no more than $35 a month for insulin prescriptions. That is money in people's pockets at home. And these efforts put pressure on drug makers to lower their prices for people not on Medicare as well. House Democrats also passed and President Biden signed into law, making historic investments to lower prescription drug prices. We extended health care coverage to millions, health care that Republicans are just trying to take away, acted on climate change, spurred American chips manufacturing, all while creating millions of jobs, and finally starting to ensure that the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes. And that's not to mention that we as House Democrats used our gavels to pass the Women's Health Protection Act to protect the right to decide whether or not to have an abortion. We passed landmark legislation to protect voting rights, to protect the civil rights of LGBTQ Americans, common sense gun safety reforms, legislation to provide a roadmap to citizenship to dreamers and farm workers, bills that provided an increase to the federal minimum wage and protecting the right to collective bargaining, all with the slim margins that Republicans now blame for gridlock. What we did the last two Congresses is what real leadership looks like. We didn't waste months of staff time and taxpayer resources chasing empty investigations to score cheap political points. Reject this bad faith resolution, and let's focus on things that actually deliver for the American people. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jayapal.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following reports showing the economic benefits of immigration. A report by Giovanni Perry, The Economic Benefits of Immigration. A report by the National Bureau of Economic Research, The Economic Contribution of Unauthorized Workers and Industry Analysis. A report by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, Undocumented Immigrant State and Local Contributions. 3 reports by New American Economy examining the economic contributions of undocumented immigrants by country of origin, Keeping Medicare Solvent, How Immigrants Subsidize Medicare's Trust Fund for All U.S. Seniors, and a third one, Immigrants Contribute More in Insurance Premiums Than They Receive in Benefits. A report by the George W. Bush Institute, Benefits of Immigration Outweigh the Costs. A report by the Bipartisan Policy Center, Immigrants and Public Benefits, What Does the Research Say? A report by Forward U.S., The Positive Economic Impact of Immigration. A report by the University of Pennsylvania Wharton Business School, The Effects of Immigration on the U.S. Economy. And a report by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Immigrants Contribute Greatly to the U.S. Economy Despite the Trump Administration's Public Charge Rule Rationale.
Just for clarification, those are reports on immigrants, not illegal immigrants.
These are reports on immigrants and the economic benefits of immigration, which include documented and undocumented immigrants.
Right, which is what the Democrats love to do, is to conflate.
Mr. Chairman, are we having a colloquy? Because I'm happy to engage in it, but I had a unanimous consent request.
I just want to clarify.
I want to clarify
reports.
that
I appreciate
undocumented
that.
immigrants and documented immigrants contribute to the U.S. economy, and any indications that they do not is excluding the contributions of undocumented immigrants as well as documented
And I
immigrants.
just wanted to be clear that you're confusing the two. Thank you.
I'm not confusing the two, Mr. Chairman. I'm including both because both contribute.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Is there any objection? Seeing none, the unanimous.
Chairman, as we hurtle towards a government shutdown, with House Republicans unable to fulfill their most basic responsibility of agreeing to a funding plan that keeps the government going, last night we shut down the floor because they couldn't even pass their own rules. And yet, here we are, having another hearing to discuss migrants who have crossed the border. And I am sure that once again, we will hear the same false talking points, blaming everything on Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden. The fact is that this country needs fundamental reforms, positive reforms, to an outdated immigration system that desperately needs to be modernized, that would allow for multiple legal pathways for immigrants who are already contributing to our country and those who seek to come to this country to contribute. There is so much fear-mongering going on that it is difficult to know exactly where to start. But let me say this. First, the Biden administration is enforcing immigration laws. In fact, the administration has been so heavy-handed in recent months that I have serious concerns about how they are conducting border enforcement. This is especially true when it comes to the administration's regulations that limit access to asylum and the use of expedited processing procedures for families. Today, there are nearly 38,000 people in immigration and customs enforcement detention, which, by the way, is what the Trump administration averaged in fiscal year 2018. But if you listen to my colleagues on the other side, you would think that there are 0 people in detention. The Biden administration has also significantly increased removals in a way that I worry violates migrants' due process rights and their ability to lawfully seek asylum. Since the end of Title 42 last year, the Biden administration has removed or returned to Mexico over 400,000 individuals, including over 65,000 individual members of family units, including children. This total is nearly equivalent to the number of people removed in all of fiscal year 2019 under Donald Trump. So the idea that the administration is not enforcing the law is ridiculous. Second, and I think this is a really important point, this hearing is supposed to distract the American people from the fact that my Republican colleagues have absolutely no accomplishments to run on. Once again, they are trying to scapegoat immigrants by making claims about undocumented immigrants' use of social services. However, under our laws, they are not eligible for the vast majority of federal benefits. But beyond that, it is absurd to say that immigrants are a drain on the economy. Study after study have proven that the U.S. economy is driven by immigrants, both documented and undocumented. Undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $7 billion in sales and excise taxes, $3.6 billion in property taxes, and $1.1 billion in personal income taxes every year. In 2019 alone, Mexican undocumented households contributed nearly $9 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. And that same year, undocumented Mexican workers contributed $14.5 billion to Social Security and Medicare through the taxes taken out of their paychecks, which means that they contributed billions of dollars to entitlement programs that American citizens have the access to, but those undocumented immigrants have no ability to benefit from. Immigrants don't hurt the economy. Let me say that again to the American people who may be watching this fiasco. Immigrants do not hurt the economy. What hurts us are antiquated laws that require the detention of lawful asylum seekers and inefficient and arbitrary waiting periods for work authorization. Laws that lack sufficient lawful pathways for those seeking refuge or better opportunities here. Thanks to President Biden, unemployment is at the lowest level in 50 years. But while employers are growing, they cannot find the workers they need despite attempts to hire American workers. The system keeps out so many immigrants who could help fill these crucial economic needs. As we have been saying for months, we need to expand lawful pathways for those seeking protection to ease the burden at the border. As crises reverberate around the globe and more people need refuge, the law remains frozen in time. We have not had significant updates to the overall immigration system in roughly 30 years. And sadly, in this Congress, led by a party that continues to be paralyzed by self-inflicted wounds, needed immigration reform appears to be out of reach. And now, the administration's supplemental border funding request, which has a lot for both parties to like, has turned into a partisan political football where we are refusing aid to Ukraine against Russian invasion because Republicans want to shut down immigration. Ignoring this request imperils the safe mobility offices in the hemisphere, where migrants can be assessed for their eligibility for refugee status or other lawful pathways. These centers encourage migrants to forego taking the dangerous journey to the border, relieving. These centers need additional funding to be successful. People want to lawfully. When the Biden administration provided Nicaraguans and Haitians, border crossings between ports of entry from those countries by 99%. Alternatively, when the Trump administration cut off refugees from the Congo, we started seeing Congolese refugees at the southern border when we had never seen them there before. We also desperately need the additional funds requested for the Shelter and Services Program to reimburse states, localities, and NGOs working to welcome migrants. These are vital funds that would aid many of the states that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say are overburdened. Unfortunately, Republicans in the House remain obsessed with pushing H.R. 2, their cruel, extreme, and unworkable legislation, which would only create more chaos at the border. The Senate has made it clear that that bill is a non-starter. And I worry that some of my colleagues are pushing that legislation because they actually have no interest in actually solving the problem. It is politically beneficial to them to have immigrants out there as a tool to create political division. Just last week, when a member of this subcommittee gave the game away when he said, quote, "I'm not willing to do too damn much right now to help a Democrat and to help Joe Biden's approval rating." We have been trying an enforcement-only strategy for 30 years, and the results are plain for everyone to see. We can only solve the complex issue of immigration by addressing it holistically and in a bipartisan way that deals with our economic, our humanitarian, and our security needs, not an end run around Congress for bad policy in a supplemental funding bill. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses and the perspectives they bring on this issue. I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Order for amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very disheartened by the massive attempt to deregulate higher education, rewinding the clock to return students to the chaotic DeVos Department of Education, including by the repealing of the borrower defense to repayment rule. Borrower defense is a critical targeted tool to protect students who are the victims of fraud, misrepresentation, and illegal conduct by their universities. I met with some of these students from now defunct colleges, including the Seattle Art Institute in my district. Their lives have been upended by the previous administration's failure to protect and relieve these college scam victims. They enrolled in arts programs that never taught them the skills that they would need to stand out in the job market. In the end, they were saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of student debt and a worthless degree, while their college executives simply left them in the dust with their profits. I also recall how the DeVos's 2019 rewrite to the borrower defense rule would have made it impossible for defrauded borrowers to receive the relief to which they were legally entitled. It set an absurdly short statute of limitations and established a higher burden of proof for harmed student loan borrowers than any other consumer protection law. Only 3% of student loans associated with illegal institutional conduct would have been forgiven under the previous administration's rewrite. The DeVos rule was so severely harmful that the House and the Senate voted on a bipartisan basis to pass a CRA overturning it in 2020. I am proud that the Biden administration's regulations improved the implementation of borrower defense to bring critical help to students who are harmed by unscrupulous colleges. This includes discharges for 560,000 former Corinthian college students, totaling $5.8 billion, after the now defunct chain was found to have engaged in such widespread misrepresentation about student outcomes, such as job placement rates. Since 2022, the Biden administration has provided over $14.5 billion in discharges to nearly 1.1 million eligible borrowers through borrower defense. Repealing the borrower defense to repayment rule will make it harder for borrowers who have been defrauded or misled by their schools, just like Corinthian, to seek justice. And it will prevent bad actors from being held accountable for fraud and abuse. It is vital that this tool for recourse to make borrowers whole remains intact. We will continue to fight for the people. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield back.
It's a ranking member, but boy, I thoroughly disagree with him on his statement. He spoke about the Senate bill, and I just want to briefly speak about that, even if we're digressing for a moment. The Senate bill was awful. It was terrible. In fact, the supposed conservative senator who helped to put this together is censured in his own state for what he did by the legislature there. The bill didn't finish building the wall. This terrible bill didn't expedite sending people back to the country of origin. This bill didn't maintain or actually put in place again, which worked, the Remain in Mexico policy. This bill didn't stop catch and release. That's only mentioning a few. It actually codified. It made legal what is an illegal activity. I don't get what some folks refuse to get about this. We have all the issues and the problems that we have now because we're allowing an illegal activity to take place and pretending that it's legal. It reminds me, in some jurisdictions where they're trying, liberal prosecutors, to reduce penalties from felonies to misdemeanors so they can say their felony count has gone down and that their city is getting safer. You can't codify, you can't make legal illegal activity. And that's, one of the many problems with the Senate bill. It was literally better to do nothing than to do that Senate bill. It wasn't compromised, it wasn't good, it was completely unfocused and wrong, and I think we've seen that. And that's why it didn't even come up for a vote in the Senate. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump, it has nothing to do with the House. At the end of the day, they couldn't even get it up for a vote. I know Ms. Jackson Lee, no, actually it was the ranking member, mentioned Georgia. And I thought he was going to mention the case of Lincoln Riley in Georgia, innocent young college student who was murdered by somebody who was illegal and shouldn't have been on the street. It's just common sense, man. I mean, I don't know what we're doing in this country. You can't bring this woman's life back. For all the talking points you may have, she's dead. And then finally, addressing the amendment, there is a mechanism for this. And I could go through, I won't, all of the precedent in the immigration courts over and over again. We now already can detain people, especially when we consider them dangerous, who have only been accused. This is nothing new. It's nothing we haven't done before, but we need to enforce it. And if there is something wrong, if it is a mistaken identity, if it is a problem where somebody shouldn't have been accused or shouldn't be detained or shouldn't be deported, they are going to have their day in the immigration court. Due diligence will be served with this legislation. I support it. We need to pass it. I think we need to show the American people, for God's sake, that we're trying to do something to stop what's happening.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will yield.
I'm very curious about the mention you made of the Senate bill that it would codify something that is currently illegal. Would you mind sharing with us what you're talking about?
Sure. I reclaim my time. It would allow up to close to 2 million illegal aliens to be processed and pushed through into our country every year. And if the president chose to, he could change the ceiling and allow more than that. Supposedly there was a maximum limit, but it gives him the jurisdiction to go ahead and actually increase that number. That's wrong. That's not what people are looking for. We need to button up the border. Once the border is buttoned up and we know that we're safer, then we can look at immigration laws and look at the areas that need to be adjusted to allow good, legal immigrants that love this country. When you see, and I'm going to talk about this later, but when you see that there were individuals in New York who were beating the daylights, a ton of them beating the daylights out of 2 cops, and then they did get arrested. They were released the next day, and as they walked out, they gave the double middle finger to the United States of America and to all of us. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, let me tell you about, and I spoke about this last time, the legal immigrants that we want in America are people who love this country and pledge their support for the United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am rising in strong support of my colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee's amendment. It is a very good amendment. It would simply bring the bill more in line with current law by requiring that an individual actually be convicted of or admit to committing a robbery offense in order to be subject to mandatory detention. That seems like a very reasonable amendment, and I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will support it. Last month, my Republican colleagues were busy trying to deport immigrants, including lawful permanent residents, without requiring a conviction before removal. Today, They want to subject immigrants, including those in a lawful status like DACA or TPS, to mandatory detention, even if they are never charged with a crime. When it comes to immigration, it seems that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can only think in terms of enforcement, even though that very enforcement-only approach has proven to be wholly ineffective. Even the most draconian immigration laws have not prevented people from seeking refuge here, and expanding the mandatory detention criteria will not keep us safer. The Immigration and Nationality Act has impossible requirements that no administration has ever been able to meet, and no Congress has ever appropriated sufficient funds to detain everybody that is listed in the current mandatory detention categories. And despite that fact, my Republican colleagues' answer is they want to expand those categories. Under this bill, a wide range of people, including DACA and TPS recipients, would be subject to mandatory detention simply for being arrested for a robbery offense. It doesn't matter that these individuals may never actually be charged with a crime, or that their arrest could be a case of mistaken identity, as the ranking member described. Arrests due to mistaken identity are bad enough, but as Mr. Massey discussed in an earlier iteration of this markup, there are real concerns about racial disparities in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools. In one particularly egregious case, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified by an automatic facial recognition search. At the time of her arrest, she was 8 months pregnant. The police handcuffed her in front of her crying daughters and her fiancé and held her for 11 hours before she was released on a $100,000 bond. Prosecutors did not dismiss the case against her for another month. If the woman had been on DACA or TPS, under this bill, ICE would have been required to pick her up upon her release, and her son would have been born in immigration detention. And this is all despite the fact that she did absolutely nothing wrong. This bill is a very serious and broad expansion of current law. It's also unnecessary, by the way. Immigrants who admit to or are convicted of serious robbery offenses are subject to mandatory detention under the Immigration and Nationality Act, and there's no justification for an expansion that mandates detention for those who are simply arrested or charged with robbery. People are often wrongfully arrested, or they're arrested and never charged with a crime. Right now, ICE is detaining more people than Congress has authorized funds for. Even still, this administration, like every other administration before it, is not even close to detaining everyone in the mandatory detention categories. I also worry that this legislation will make communities less safe. Under this bill, an individual that is subject to mandatory detention would have an immigration detainer placed on them so that they can be picked up by the Department of Homeland Security. For this to work, local law enforcement agencies would have to hold the immigrant until ICE is able to take custody. Local law enforcement agencies, however, need to have the trust of all of the members of their community, including immigrants, to effectively do their job. But that trust can be eroded if state and local law enforcement officers are viewed by the immigrant community as working on behalf of ICE. The Major Cities Chiefs Association has specifically addressed this issue, stating that lack of trust in local law enforcement can, quote, result in increased crime against immigrants in the broader community, create a class of silent victims, and eliminate the potential for assistance from immigrants in solving crimes or preventing future terroristic acts, end quote. Instead of working together on a bipartisan solution to fix the broken immigration system, here we are marking up a bill that has zero chance of becoming law. I hope my colleagues will work with us to pass this amendment and to accomplish a real goal of addressing immigration instead of passing more flawed bills like this. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know who's subject to mandatory detention? Anybody charged with robbery in federal court. U.S. citizen, non-U.S. citizen, anybody. It's a presumptive detention hold. Like it or not, illegal immigrants who are in this country are under the subject of federal jurisdiction. This isn't changing or expanding the law. It's allowing another federal agency to enact the law in the same way as which the federal court system does. That is the only difference. You want to talk about pretrial release reform in federal court, I'm your guy. Like, I'll sit down and work with anybody. But the reality is, if you're charged with robbery in federal court, you are going to be detained. The only difference here is we're asking another federal agency to apply the law in the same exact manner in which the federal court system applies the law. That's it. They are under federal jurisdiction. We wish they weren't. We wish they weren't here illegally, but when they are, they're under federal jurisdiction, not just the state in which they're in. All we're doing is applying the same rule to them that we apply to anybody else who is charged with this crime in federal court. Sure, we're moving it from one agency to the other in case they're charged in state court instead of federal court. If you're talking about wrongful detention, innocent until proven guilty, mistaken identity, I think there's a lot of people sitting in federal detention all across the country right now that would love to have that conversation because they don't get out.
Yeah.
There is no bond in federal court. You're either released or you're detained. All we're doing is saying that if you are an illegal immigrant and there is jurisdiction over you federally, we're going to treat you like anybody else who's arrested and charged federally. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Has expired. Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by noting that one of our witnesses was one of the leading architects of the Trump administration's cruel and horrific family separation policy. I was the first member of Congress to go and meet with separated moms detained in federal prison. I heard firsthand how the Trump administration imposed a zero humanity policy to prosecute parents in mass court proceedings, resulting in the United States government under Donald Trump tearing thousands of children from their moms and dads. None of the mothers that I met with even got to say goodbye to their children. Some were put in rooms right next to their children, and they could hear their children sobbing for them, and they never got to say goodbye. I am still to this day haunted by the testimonials that I heard from parents and from children. The Department of Justice Inspector General came out with a detailed report that says that Attorney General Sessions and his top aides, like our witness, Mr. Hamilton, were the key drivers of that policy. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter that report into the record.
Without objection.
We have memos that were leaked, filled with edits and comments from Mr. Hamilton, where he clearly approves of a plan to, quote, begin separating family units, end quote, and is even looking for ways to ensure that children who are separated from their families are removed as quickly as possible. I ask unanimous consent that that be placed into the record as well.
Without objection.
And thanks to Democratic oversight efforts, we know the tragic results of Donald Trump's cruel family separation policy. Today, as many as 2,000 children still remain separated from their parents. And we have testimony from child welfare experts that the best available evidence shows that Donald Trump's policy of tearing children from their parents, quote, entails very significant and potentially lifelong risks of psychological and physical harm. So, Mr. Hamilton, my question for you is simple. Do you regret the role that you played in the family separation policy? Yes or no?
I would refer you to the statement that I provided.
I asked for a yes or no answer.
I'm giving you an answer. I'm not going to give you a yes or no. I would refer you to the statement that I provided to the Inspector General about my assessment of their report and the accuracy thereof.
A 2021 DOJ Inspector General report determined that your office, after investigation, after talking to you, the Office of the Attorney General was the, quote, driving force behind the family separation policy. The Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, actually issued a statement of regret for his role. I assume that you have no such statement of regret to offer us today?
I think if you read my statement and not just the hatchet job that the Inspector General's office issued, you would see my feelings about the matter.
The evidence clearly indicates that your zero humanity policy was intended to permanently separate children from their parents. It is a fact that DOJ did not coordinate with HHS or even give HHS a heads up on the policy before rolling out the family separation policy. And as you know very well, children deemed or rendered unaccompanied are in HHS custody, and the DOJ Inspector General noted your own experience coordinating across multiple agencies to implement policy. You knew very well, Mr. Hamilton, exactly what you were doing. Your former colleague, Attorney General Sessions' Chief of Staff, Matt Whitaker, admitted to me under oath in this room that DOJ did not have a system in place at the outset of the family separation on the prosecution side to track separated parents and children. No less than 5 of your own prosecutors raised concerns with you about what was to happen to separated kids in the days after you released the policy. And your boss's response was, we need to take away children. And I am deeply troubled that you can't even do what Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein did and actually say that you regret your role in that absolute catastrophe. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, very quickly, because I only have 18 seconds left, my colleagues claim that Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act gives the president the ability to shut down the border. Can you please explain why that's inaccurate and what happened when former President Trump tried to rely on that so-called authority to shut down the border?
Well, just as quickly as I can, it cannot override the Immigration and Nationality Act. As the Supreme Court itself said, both in 2018 and in
Microphone.
just really quickly, but the Supreme Court said in both 1993 and in 2018 that 212F cannot override the core provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. One of those is the right to seek asylum regardless of how a person enters the country. Therefore, you just cannot use it for this authority. It can be used to interdict people at sea, but that's different because they haven't arrived on U.S. soil. Migrants who've already crossed the border and are on U.S. soil cannot be turned away without authority.
Time has
I
expired.
yield back.
Thank you very much. Representative Jayapal, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today. For the second time in less than 2 months, with another shutdown looming, we are wasting our time on, yes, a nothing burger of a resolution, a meaningless immigration resolution that is full of empty rhetoric, whose sole purpose seems to be to justify Republicans' lack of desire to address actual solutions for our broken immigration system. And I think it's important that we take a step back and think about how we got here. Earlier this Congress, House Republicans passed their cruel, inhumane, and unworkable border bill, H.R. 2. Republicans, and you've just heard it, continue to say that H.R. 2 is the only way to secure the border. But that bill has actually been brought up in the Senate. It failed twice to pass the Senate, receiving just 32 votes just a few weeks ago. And then, after insisting that the only way to address the border was through this harsh border security legislation that held Ukraine aid hostage, Republicans even managed to get some Democrats to agree to a border bill in the Senate that was written largely by the second most conservative Republican member in the United States Senate, a bill that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called the toughest border bill in 30 years. You would think that would garner a lot of Republican votes. But what happened? Donald Trump said he didn't want to do anything to address the immigration issue and to, quote, help the border in an election year because he wants immigration to remain out there as a campaign political issue. Other Republicans in the House have said it out loud too, saying that they don't want to do, quote, too damn much to help a Democrat. Folding to the cult of Donald Trump, and just hours after the 370-page text of the bill was released, Speaker Johnson declared the bill, quote, dead on arrival in the House. The rank and file, of course, fell in line, and the Senate bill died before the metaphorical ink was even dry. Republicans have shown clearly what we Democrats have been saying over and over again, that they don't want to do anything that would help address the issues we face of a broken immigration system. Instead of solving the problem, Republicans just want to continue to weaponize the border as a political issue for the election year. The truth is that the situation at the border is directly linked to the fact that our legal immigration system has been left in chaos because it has not been modernized in 30 years to meet the needs of our country, our economy, and our families. when the legal process is so backed up that it takes decades for legal residents to get their children into the country, or when employers simply can't get people they need to hire approved because there's a backlog of millions of people who haven't been processed, or when we have so few immigration judges that asylum seekers can wait over 8 years to get their cases heard, yeah, then people give in to unscrupulous actors, including cartels, who promise them that they can get in by paying a lot of money to the cartels and going to the border. Until you fix the legal immigration system so that it works and update the caps and the quotas, you're going to continue to see large numbers of migrants at the border. You cannot, quote, fix the border without fixing the underlying system, and you certainly can't fix it with only harsh immigration policy. Speaker Johnson and others have been caught in their own trap. They refuse to give President Biden the resources that he has asked for to process people more quickly. Republicans have voted against more money to secure the border with more technology and equipment. They've even voted against more money for more agents at the border. And to hide their hypocrisy, they're now claiming that the president can, quote, just secure the border through harsh executive actions alone. No actions by Congress actually necessary. Today's resolution is just another ham-fisted attempt to weaponize the issue of the border, and it's filled with misinformation. The resolution alleges that the Biden administration is not removing people fast enough. Yet, in the 8 months since ending Title 42, the administration has removed or returned over 500,000 people, despite progressives' due process concerns, roughly equivalent to the number of people removed and returned by the Trump administration in all of fiscal year 2019. The resolution states that the administration, quote, could comply with the mandatory detention statutes of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which no administration, including the Trump administration, has ever complied with because no Congress has ever appropriated the extraordinary levels of funding that such compliance would require. The resolution complains that the president isn't using the suspension of entry authority in Section 212F of the INA. But Republicans would like to forget that Donald Trump tried to do exactly that in November of 2018, and he was stopped by the courts. Even the Supreme Court refused to intervene and lift the lower court injunction. Enforcement-only policies do not stop people from coming to the border. In fact, when former President Trump implemented the Remain in Mexico program early in 2019, that summer, we saw some of the highest levels of migration of the entire Trump administration. When President Trump used Title 42 to turn back all border crossers, encounters between ports of entry actually shot up. Cartels made money hand over fist by providing people with multiple entry attempt packages. One individual was apprehended over 40 times alone. In fact, from February 1st of 2017 to December 31st of 2020, the duration of Donald Trump's presidency, illegal border crossings went up by over 300%. People do not make the arduous, dangerous journey here on a whim. They do it because they are often fleeing for their lives, or they're desperate to escape an unlivable situation in their home country. And because of that, they will keep coming, no matter how many draconian policies they may have to face once they arrive. The way to, quote, fix the border is to modernize our current immigration system so that it works to provide different legal pathways for people to apply, to be with their families, or come here and work, or flee war or torture, and have their applications and claims processed in a very timely manner. We have already seen that when we provide workable ways for people to seek entry and refuge, they actually use them, and encounters between ports of entry fall dramatically. This nothing burger of a resolution shows once again that Republicans don't want to do anything to fix the border. I urge all my colleagues to oppose the resolution, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
He's recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Well, I'm hearing a very robust argument for having no resolutions in front of the House of Representatives from the other side of the aisle. And I believe if you look this up, I've probably voted against more resolutions than anybody on this committee and anybody in Congress. And that's because I read them, though, not because I don't believe they shouldn't exist. I mean, there is a purpose for resolutions. unless it's concurrent resolution or joint resolution with the Senate and then signed by the president, it doesn't become a law, doesn't have the force of law, yet we bring them up every day. The other side of the aisle has sponsored a lot of resolutions this Congress. So I think all of that discussion, though, about the complaining that this is a resolution is because they don't want to talk about what's in the resolution. And there's some very inconvenient truths in this resolution. And particularly when you contrast it with the President's State of the Union last week. He presented to us, basically a campaign speech, but he presented to us that he couldn't do anything, that there was nothing else he could do. Yet in this resolution, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 things here in the whereas clause that he could do tomorrow or today. That he's not doing. So I think it's, we should be measured in the number of resolutions we pass and in the number of post offices we name. But this is a particularly important resolution because we've tried to pass a law that would do something. The Senate won't bring it up. We've passed that here in the House, and they just won't bring it up. So, Mr. Vandrew, do you believe that that the president could end the catch and release policy?
Yes, Congressman, I do.
Ms. Jayapal, do you think he could?
Mr. Massey, I've already gone through all the reasons why these things don't work. The fact is that
I wasn't here for that, but could you tell me, could the president end the catch and release policy?
if you're talking about the mandatory detention statutes of the INA, there is no administration, including the Trump administration, that has ever complied with that because no Congress has ever appropriated the extraordinary levels of funding.
Could he reinstate the migrant protection protocols?
The Remain in Mexico program was actually stopped by, thank you.
Could he or could he not?
It was actually in effect, and you know, I wanted to mention this actually before when Mr. Van Drew was talking about the effectiveness of the MPP program. The question here is, was it effective? So from January
No,
of 2019.
that was not my question. My question is, could he do it?
But I think the question is, why would he do it, Mr. Massey?
So you're
why
saying
would he do it?
can?
Because the January of 2019.
I've got a bunch of questions.
I know, but Mr. Van Drew was given time when he
Again,
was
I would
reclaiming
just
my
ask
time.
that
when
the
he
witness and
Yeah, I want to reclaim my
do
time.
not talk over one another.
So it sounds like he could, but you don't think it would be effective. Could he enter into asylum cooperative agreements?
Well, it depends what the agreements say.
So maybe he could. Could he end abuses of parole authority?
Mr. Massey, what you're asking is, could he do things? And what I would like to talk about is what happened when Donald Trump did those things. That is what you all don't want to talk about. Even Migration Protection Program, the Remain in Mexico program, under Donald Trump, over 1.4 million people were encountered at the southern border. And you know how many times Donald Trump put migrants into the Remain in Mexico program? Only 70,000 people were placed. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm just saying when you talk about these things that Donald Trump did and say they were so effective, they weren't effective.
Well, let's look at the numbers. You said there were 1.4 million encounters under Trump. How many under Biden?
I don't have that number in front of me, but I would just remind you that that was during COVID. So when Mr. Van Drew talks about how the numbers went down, during COVID, flights were not coming to the United States. People were not traveling around the world. There was a significant reduction in migrants across the world moving during COVID.
Glad you brought up flights. Should we be paying for flights for illegal immigrants?
Well, I don't know what flights you're paying for, Mr. Massey.
And how many, I asked you about encounters at the border, which you didn't know, which is fine. I don't have these off the top of my head either under Biden, but it is in the resolution how many, looks like 9.3 million. How many have, according to the Border border control, how many have come into the country under Joe Biden?
Well, I assume you have that number in front of you.
Over 7 million, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Do you dispute that?
What I would like to say is that the numbers, when these harsh policies were instituted under Donald Trump, went up and not down. And as we have taken away the ability for people to have legal pathways to come to the United States, and as the situations around the world have changed, as climate change has increased, as countries have been dealing with their own issues, you have seen an increased flow, which is part of the reason we say, if you want to deal with this, then let's deal with the issues in sending countries.
Is climate change a legitimate asylum claim?
No, it is not.
Is
climate
seeking
change
better
real?
wages a legitimate asylum claim?
Is climate change real?
Yeah, changes all the time.
And do you think that the threats of climate change around the world are real?
I think that you have, I'm not picking on you, but I think that the people who say that it's anthropogenic really have no idea what our contribution to the climate is. And if they did, they could predict what the climate change would be, and they've failed to do
Do you think that
that.
greenhouse gases are helping to create climate change? Do you think it's man-made?
Well, I'm glad we're having a science discussion. I'll go here any day of the week.
I'm just
because
trying
I
to point
know,
out to you that there are a lot of things that
because
you all
do
say
you
that
think,
aren't true.
Do you think that crops do better with CO2, more CO2 in the air?
I think that we should make sure that we're helping to use regenerative agriculture and.
Do you want to answer that question that I just asked?
I mean, I'm happy to have that discussion with you, but I think that the issue here is.
Let's have it.
Let's talk about why people are coming.
What's
to
the
this
ideal
country.
concentration of CO2 for
Mr.
plants?
Massey, I'm not going to have that discussion with
But
you.
you brought it up and said you'd be happy to have it.
Not in this forum. What I'd like
Okay.
to do is have
Well,
a
then
conversation
don't.
about why
then,
people are coming.
Well, you're
to
the one who
United
brought up
States.
climate change as if it were a legitimate asylum
you-
claim. So I asked you if it's a legitimate asylum claim, and you said it's
It's a legitimate
not.
reason for migration. Absolutely.
But is it a legitimate? Should we accept illegal immigrants because their climate is changing?
Mr. Massey, if you understood the immigration system, you would know that there are different categories for people to be able to come to the United States to apply. There is an asylum category, there's a refugee category, there is a category for employment, there is a category for being with family, and there are a number of reasons that drive people to come to the United States.
Which one is the category that allows them to break into our country illegally because the climate has changed where they live?
Mr. Massey, I don't think that people are breaking into the country illegally, and I just want to say, I think, looking around the room, that I might be the only person who has actually gone through the legal immigration system. And when people differentiate between legal immigration and illegal immigration, the undertone from your side is that somehow people who are coming illegally are trying to break into the country, that are trying to do something wrong, when in fact it took me 17 years to go through the legal immigration system, and I am not disparaging of people who are trying to come to this country for all the reasons that drive people to come to the United States.
I did notice in your statement that you talked about illegal border crossing, so at least you acknowledge that it's illegal, and you're willing to use the word illegal in characterizing their activity, are you not?
Well, sure, of course.
So it's
Once you-
illegal for them to cross the border?
The act of crossing the border, if you are apprehended within a certain radius of the border, is considered an illegal act. That is correct.
And can you give me some other examples of asylum claims or refugee claims that aren't legitimate? Or is every claim legitimate?
No, there's very specific asylum law, and you have
Which ones are not legitimate claims?
You have to meet the standards that are defined by asylum law. And by the way, a refugee is a status that's accorded when you're outside of the country versus an asylum seeker who comes to the border to claim asylum.
If we were
Those
able
are
to
two different
intercept,
categories
okay,
by
if we
law.
were able to intercept everybody who's trying to enter this country illegally, and you acknowledge when they cross that border, that is an illegal act, so they are breaking the law. If we were able to apprehend every single one of them, and they all claim that they're refugees or they're seeking asylum, are there any that you would reject for those claims, and under what reasons?
Well, first of all, it is legal to seek asylum at the border.
Okay.
It is legal
Which ones
to
would
seek
you
asylum.
reject?
It is legal to seek asylum at the border. So not everybody who comes to the border and crosses is immediately engaged in an illegal act. But there are people who are not seeking asylum who come and cross the border, and if they're apprehended within a certain radius of the border, then that's considered.
If they tell you
considered
they're
a
seeking
crime.
asylum, would you at least give them a proceeding?
You have to have a proceeding. You
So.
have to go through at least a determination, yes.
So it seems to me like most of them that come across have been trained to say the word asylum. And then at that point, your policy would be to believe that that they should be
You have to determine
considered.
whether or not they have a legitimate asylum claim.
Okay, in that
is international
determination-
human rights law.
In that determination, what would you use to deny them asylum? What are
There
the,
is a very specific process and very specific metrics that you have to meet. One of the challenges and one of the reasons President Biden asked for more asylum officers and more immigration judges is so that people could actually have their claims heard and they could actually go through the process quickly, because right now we don't have enough. And so if you're interested in having people be assessed and their claims be processed quickly, then the best thing to do would be to add immigration judges and asylum officers so that you could actually get those claims heard. And when people are given the determination, they generally leave.
I hope you
So-
feel like I'm giving you enough time.
I do now.
Okay.
Yes.
Should they be, if they're seeking asylum and they commit a crime, should they be detained?
Well, right now, I mean, if there's, it depends on what status they're in. These are technical questions that a lot of it depends on what status they're in.
I feel like they should be detained. Do you support building a wall?
I do not think that a wall is going to solve our problems, no.
Do a majority of your, how would you characterize the position of your party? Does it generally support building a wall or not?
I think the position of our party is we should have comprehensive, humane immigration reform that modernizes the immigration system so that we can have an orderly process for people to be able to be with their families and contribute to our economy.
So not building a wall. Let me just focus on one other small set of questions. I appreciate everybody's indulgence and patience here. Are you aware that when somebody is here illegally, or maybe they say they're seeking asylum or they're a refugee or whatever their claim is, but they're not a citizen, that they are counted in the census and that is used to allocate seats in the House of Representatives? Like the population of people who are not here legally is used to be counted in the census and in the apportionment of representatives.
Yes, every single person in this country is counted.
So even the illegal immigrants are counted.
Every person in this country is counted, and that is according to our Constitution.
Should illegal, I don't think our founding fathers foresaw this situation, and I have sponsored a constitutional amendment to remedy this, but should illegal immigrants be counted for the purposes of apportioning representatives of the House or the Electoral College?
If you're suggesting that people who have undocumented status should not count for the work that they do and the contributions that they make to this country, I would say absolutely I do not agree with that. I think every person should count and is important to be counted.
Counted for what, though? Should they be able to vote?
Well, you know, there used to be places that did allow people to vote in local elections, school board elections and things like that. But
Should they be able to vote in presidential races or in the House, or for representatives here in the House of
I
Representatives?
think the question is, how do we treat the people that pick our foods, are on the front lines of our healthcare crisis, are doing the farm work that we need done, are serving us in numerous ways, are doctors, lawyers, contributors to our economy, and yet are unable to get legal immigration status because Congress and Republicans in Congress over decades have refused to fix the immigration system so that we can just continue to talk about immigrants as if somehow they don't contribute and they're a drain on our economy. The CBO just came out with a study that showed that the unexpected migration into this country contributed $7 trillion to our GDP, $1 trillion more in revenues than was expected. But I never hear anybody on your side ever talk about that. All we hear is about the drain on our economy and how immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are so terrible. I'd love to hear you talk about the contributions.
The great thing about this committee is I don't have a 5-minute counter. Now, my colleagues may not agree. So what I get to do is ask you the same question again until you answer it or until it becomes painfully obvious that you won't. Should people here who are not citizens be allowed to vote for president or be allowed to vote for U.S. representatives?
I think there are many places that are considering local elections and people being able to weigh in, for example, on school board elections. And I think that that's appropriate.
So let me ask the question again, because I don't have a 5-minute timer. Should people who are not citizens of the United States be able to vote
I am not
in the
advocating
president?
for...
Please don't talk over me, and I'll give you the same courtesy. Should people who are not citizens of the United States be allowed to vote in the for president or for members of the House of Representatives?
Are you including legal permanent residents as well as undocumented immigrants?
I'm including, and I would like you in your answer to include asylum seeker, people who say they're seeking asylum, people who have crossed the border illegally and we don't know they're here, and people who claim to be refugees but are not citizens. Should they be allowed to vote
You know,
in the presidential race or for a race for U.S. House of
at
Representatives?
this point for that, but I do think we should think about how we ensure that people, for example, are legal permanent residents. I was a legal permanent resident for quite some time for a variety of circumstances, even though technically you should be able to become a citizen when you're after 5 years. But I do think that there's a place to think about different categories of people being able to make their voice heard in our democracy, but I'm not advocating for undocumented immigrants to be able to vote in congressional or presidential elections.
Now, let me get to my original question that I'm trying to get to, or where I started, is should that population of people be counted toward the apportionment of representatives? So, for instance, there are probably at least 6 extra representatives for the state of California because of the policy that non-citizens are counted not just in the census, but they're also counted toward apportionment of representatives for the House and also for the Electoral College. There are only 6 representatives in total for the state of Kentucky. So there are more people in the state of California who are not citizens, who are counted for the Electoral College and counted for the apportionment of representatives than there are in the state of Kentucky. Do you think that is fair or something that we should continue doing?
I think that every person deserves to be counted, yes.
But for a presidential vote?
I believe that everybody deserves to be counted for our census, and that is the rules around how our census is determined. I mean, if you want to talk about, we can also get into the Electoral College and how your state has 2 senators, but a giant state like California also has 2 senators. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which we can talk about fairness or what's perceived as fairness in our electoral system.
Mr. Van Drew, do you think that illegal immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers should be counted toward the apportionment of representatives in this House of Representatives?
No, I don't. And there are those, and quite frankly, in confidence, those that are on the other side of the aisle of me who said that a major reason this is all occurring is because it will shift what happens with the census, which will affect the congressional apportionment, which will affect the Electoral College as well. And my person who told me that, who's a friend, and again, I would never mention his name, said, we are going to get to the point that we're bulletproof. You will never be able to win an election again.
And this was somebody on the other side of the aisle talking to you.
Yes, and you'll never find out who it is.
Well, that's fine.
Man, would they be in trouble.
No, I appreciate that you're not disclosing that person, but you know, when I try to find out why do Democrats and Republicans see this so differently? Why is it that we will all with ease vote for this resolution because it's just full of common sense and things that a majority of the Americans support, and then it that's in the whereas clause, and then it resolves things that the president can do that he's not doing. So I look for what is the difference? Why would people from blue states be so adamant that this is not a problem or that these are not fixes or that it's not fixable when in fact it is? And the one thing I keep coming back to is in the census, not only do we count illegal immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, but they count toward the Electoral College. And this predominantly helps the blue states. And so they don't even need to get them to vote, although we've heard they would let them vote in some races, maybe not others. That is a magnet. That is a magnet. That is a reason. Now you have a political reason, and I think we're getting to the crux of why the other side is rejecting this resolution. If it doesn't do anything, it should be easy for them to vote for. But the reality is it does something. It puts a fine point on what the president said at the State of the Union, the things that he said which are not true. And it shows that this president could do a lot to fix the border tomorrow, and he's not. And so I appreciate both of your time, and yield back.
And the gentleman from Washington's a kind person as well, and she is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Gentleman from Florida reserves point of order.
Amendment to the
Without
amendment.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Washington is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What happened to Sarah Root is a tragedy, and as a mother, my heart aches for her family. No parent should ever have to go through the unbearable pain of having to bury their child. Sadly, passing this legislation would not bring Sarah's killer to justice. Sarah's family was failed by the government on multiple levels, and in fact, I know that they've been going after the local judge in this particular case. Fundamentally, this is a problem best solved at the local level, where they are better equipped to avoid unintended consequences. Unfortunately, the legislation before us today is an imprecise federal bill that would make a massive change to the national immigration system. This sort of bill acts a bit like a sledgehammer, hammering away at the problem, but causing an enormous amount of damage in its wake. Through this bill's extraordinary breadth, it will put large numbers of people, including DACA recipients and TPS holders, at risk of being subject to mandatory detention, even if they are innocent of the crimes of which they are accused. Like all of the immigration enforcement bills we have marked up so far in this Congress, this bill does absolutely nothing to fix the immigration system, and it has zero chance of becoming law. On the day before the government is set to shut down, this is not how we should be spending our time. We should perhaps be discussing the recent Congressional Budget Office's assessment that over the next 10 years, immigration is going to grow the economy by $7 trillion and increase revenue by $1 trillion. We could discuss how a new government study shows that refugees and asylees have a net positive impact of $124 billion over 10 years. But no, instead, we're taking up legislation that has no chance of becoming law, does nothing to fix the system, and demonizes immigrants and immigration. The amendment I'm offering today would address some of the very broad consequences of this bill. Under the current version, someone can be subject to mandatory immigration detention simply for being arrested or charged with a crime that led to serious bodily injury or death. But as we have discussed in the previous bills that we've discussed in this committee, people are mistakenly arrested and charged with crimes far too often in this country. Do we really think that it makes sense to subject them to mandatory detention, even if they were wrongly arrested and then exonerated, a mistaken arrest can be a huge burden on an innocent person. Just look at what happened last year in Kenosha, Wisconsin. An African-American couple was eating dinner at an Applebee's with their 1-year-old son when the police came in looking for a couple who had just committed a hit and run. While the actual perpetrators hid in the restroom, the police violently arrested the innocent couple even while the father was holding the child in his arms. It took half a year in court to get the charges against this couple dropped, but the psychological and emotional scars from that, I'm sure, still remain. If this couple had been DACA or TPS recipients, and this bill was the law of the land, they might be in immigration detention now, even 2 months after they were exonerated. My amendment would also require that there be a conviction before the mandatory notification requirement under this bill takes effect. Releasing this type of personal information to a victim's family based on a mere charge is extremely dangerous, and it is not something we should be doing. Last month, we unanimously moved Mr. Massey's bill, H.R. 6824, out of committee. That bill is aimed at identifying and preventing the negative consequences of racially biased misidentifications in the gun background check system. I don't understand why we would want to move forward with a bill today that would amplify those same negative consequences in the immigration system. We passed Mr. Massey's bill in a bipartisan manner, and I hope that my colleagues are willing to work with us on this legislation as well. Unfortunately, without my amendment, the bill before us today has significant unintended consequences, and I would not be able to support it. I urge my colleagues to accept my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I will. The gentleman withdraws his point of order. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I would just remind my friend that Laken Riley's accused killer was never convicted of a prior crime. He was arrested and released by New York authorities. Arrested and released. Arrested and released. That's the Democrats' favorite pastime in our cities that they control, and it's a principal cause of the carnage which those cities are now suffering, and whose constituents are now starting to awaken to the damage of these foolish policies. We've been through this discussion many times before on similar bills, but since the gentlelady wishes to make her points again, I'll make my points again as well. I wish for a change that the Democrats would be just as concerned with the rights of Americans as they are with the rights of illegal aliens and the crimes that they're committing in our communities. But let's just call this out real quick. Under current law, an alien already can be subject to mandatory detention without a conviction. We've gone through these examples many times, but somehow they just don't sink in. An illegal alien who admits to committing a crime involving moral turpitude, or who admits to committing a controlled substance offense. Any alien, including a green card holder who commits a drug offense. All of these are subject to mandatory detention under current law. In 2019, the Supreme Court noted the expansive nature of mandatory detention. They highlighted that part of the reason for mandatory detention is to reach aliens who necessarily escape conviction, and another part sweeps in aliens for whom there is no reason to expect police, as opposed to immigration officials, will have reason to arrest. That's why we have these provisions in law. Under current law, even the spouses and children of certain illegal aliens must be detained if the DHS secretary knows or has reason to believe that a spouse or parent trafficked drugs and the family members knowingly received a benefit, financial or otherwise, from that activity. So if it's the breadth of this policy that the Democrats are concerned about, it certainly sounds like they'd like to strike down the entire mandatory
would the gentleman
detention
yield?
section. No, not till I'm done. So again, your objection is the entire mandatory detention section, which already has been the law of the land.
That's why I was asking if you
applied
yield.
to aliens for decades. Sarah's law makes so much sense that I think Americans would be surprised to know that it's not already the law of the land. This amendment would strike this provision, and let me
Would the gentleman yield? I just want to clarify something,
Let
Mr.
me
Chairman.
raise one other set of points first. We keep hearing that these are illegal aliens who will be wrongly detained. But here's the reality. Aliens who are inadmissible for being in the U.S. illegally or lacking valid documents should have been detained once they crossed the border in the first place. And they should have been continued in detention throughout their immigration proceedings. That is the current law. And aliens who've had their visas revoked or failed to comply with their non-immigrant status no longer have a basis to remain in the United States. To even lodge a detainer against an alien or to arrest an alien in the first place, DHS has to have probable cause that the alien is removable from the United States. Once detained, if an alien claims he's wrongly subject to mandatory detention, he can request review before an immigration judge, who will then determine whether the alien is in fact an alien, whether he fits within the category of mandatory detention, and whether DHS is substantially unlikely to establish that the alien is subject to mandatory detention. All those rights are in existing law, and all of those rights apply in this case. And that detention is far from indefinite. According to data from the Executive Office for Immigration Review, the median case completion time for an alien in detention was only 42 days in fiscal year 2033. Yet if the alien is truly innocent and wrongly detained, as the Democrats argue, then the alien can quickly receive asylum and be released. If the Democrats cared about public safety and the constituents they serve, I think they would reject the amendment and they would support this bill. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and I'll be happy to yield to the gentlelady for my remaining time.
I may need a little bit more time, but I just wanted to be very clear about something. I am granting that if somebody is convicted of or admits having committed or admits committing acts which constitute the essential elements of any offense that resulted in the death or serious bodily injury, I'm not touching that, Mr. Chairman. My amendment does not do anything with that.
Reclaiming my time. You should at least understand that that person,
I think your time is expired.
That person is subject to detention anyway because they've committed the crime of illegally crossing the border.
I think
further discussion.
Process point here, Mr. Chairman. I think your time is over.
By 10 seconds. It was by 10 seconds.
I know, but
you interrupted me. But I'll be happy to recognize Ms. Scanlon now.
Thank you, and I yield to the gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you. Again, I just wanted to make it clear that it is the case right now that if you're convicted of or admit to having convicted or admit committing acts which constitute the essential elements of any offense that resulted in the death or serious bodily injury, you are subject to mandatory detention. What this bill does, though, it expands that dramatically. And it says if you are charged with or arrested for, and that is the problem that I have. That is why I am submitting my amendment, because I am saying just being charged with or being arrested for a crime does not mean that you should suddenly give up all your due process rights and be mandatorily detained. So I am saying, yes, I understand what the law says right now, but this bill is a dramatic over-expansion, and it fundamentally hurts due process rights. And frankly, it's extremely dangerous, because if somebody is just charged with a crime or is just arrested for a crime, you're essentially saying that from that point on, they have to be mandatorily detained. Not only has no administration ever been able to mandatorily detain everybody that is subject to mandatory detention right now, that's true of Republicans and Democratic administrations. But now what you're saying is we're going to expand that population even more, and we're going to mandatorily detain or require to mandatorily detain people who are just charged with a crime. And the reason I brought up Mr. Massey's bill from last time is because we know that people are charged unjustly all the time. We know that that happens, and we need to be really sure that we're protecting due process for everybody. And I care about due process for everybody regardless of legal status. I care about due process for the people that are here in this country, making sure that we have the ability for people to go through that process. And so all my amendment does is say, let's make sure we at least have due process for people who are charged with or arrested for, but not yet haven't gone through the process, don't have a conviction, haven't admitted to having convicted. I don't touch any of that that's in your bill, Mr. Chairman. I literally just have an amendment saying if you're charged with or arrested with, you should not be mandatorily detained because you haven't gone through the legal due process that you are due for. So that is what my amendment is, and I reject the assertion that somehow Democrats want to not adhere even to what is current law or want to allow everybody. No, we just want people to have due process, and what your bill does is expand dramatically and hurt the due process rights, including, by the way, of legal residents who are here, people who are on TPS, people who are DACA recipients, people who have the legal ability to be here. This is a real problem, and I think everybody, including on the other side, if you believe in due process, you should want to support this amendment. I yield back to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Biggs.
Our Arizona Reserve's point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7187 offered by Ms. Jayapal. Page 2.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply disappointed. I'm not surprised, but I'm deeply disappointed that my Republican colleagues have brought this harmful bill to a markup to attack the transgender community one more time. The way this bill targets trans people in the name of gender equality is simply insulting. Don't believe for a second that this is about protecting women and girls. My amendment would require a report on the impacts of this bill on all female athletes, since categorical bans on trans women harm all women. That is why women's organizations across the country, including the Women's Sports Foundation, have denounced categorical bans on trans athletes for promoting fear, dangerous stereotypes, unfair scrutiny on high-performing female athletes, and sex discrimination based on misinformation. And just think about this for a second. How are you going to enforce this ban? How do you verify a girl or a woman's, quote, reproductive anatomy? We have already seen horrific sexual abuse against girls and women in sports. If a woman or a young girl, if your daughter doesn't look feminine enough, is she subject to an examination? This is absurd and insulting. Instead of focusing on the real issues that female athletes face, including a lack of financial resources, vulnerability to abuse, and wage gaps, Republicans are instead choosing to appropriate the rhetoric, just the rhetoric, of women's rights to obscure what seems to be a deeply felt hate for gender inclusivity and prejudice against the trans community. Time and time again, Republicans have refused to work with Democrats to work on legislation that would meaningfully protect and support women and girls. Let's just take a quick look at the track record. Last Congress, House Democrats passed the Paycheck Fairness Act to combat gender-based wage discrimination, and one Republican voted for it. We passed the Women's Health Protection Act to protect abortion access twice, and each time not a single Republican voted for it. And now many Republicans won't even stand up to attacks on IVF. Instead of protecting women, Republicans are focused on limiting women's rights and autonomy. They have supported nationwide abortion bans, and now they're trying to ban trans athletes against the guidance of international athletic institutions that have long recognized categorical bans are unnecessary to achieve fairness. Now, I want to be clear, the International Olympic Committee has allowed transgender women to compete in the Olympics since 2003. And since then, only one transgender woman has ever gone to the Olympics. That's right, one. And by the way, she was an alternate. One of the things I want to point out here is that of the estimated 332 million people in the United States that identify as transgender, 1.3 million adults and youth 13 to 17 who identify as transgender. This is a tiny, tiny portion of the population. In fact, it's 0.5% of adults and youth between the ages of 13 and 17, and 1.4% of the entire population. That's what we're spending all this time on with these trans bans. The IOC's own framework on fairness and inclusion states, and this is a quote, "No athlete should be excluded from competition on the exclusive ground of an unverified, alleged, or perceived unfair competitive advantage due to their transgender status." That is why the IOC defers to the governing body of each sport to determine eligibility requirements. And in line with the IOC recommendations, national governing boards have developed policies that allow for the inclusion of trans athletes, recognizing the fact that categorical bans aren't needed to preserve fairness, as no one factor determines an athlete's abilities. All this conversation does is stoke prejudice and embolden people to discriminate. Almost half of transgender people in the United States will attempt suicide at least once in their life, and trans people are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to experience violent victimization. These bills directly harm some of the most vulnerable people in this country and tell them that they don't belong. I am the proud mother of a trans daughter. And every time these bills come up, I ask you to think about what it would be like if your daughter was the one that you were talking about. What would it be like if you were telling your daughter that she does not have the right to be who she is? Every one of you has children. I ask you to please stop targeting our trans community that is already vulnerable, that already faces so many challenges. Why are you doing this? It is a tiny portion of people across the country that identify as trans, and not a single one of them is doing anything to harm you or your family. Stop it. Stop it. We have better things to do in Congress, things that could actually lift people up across this country. Vote yes on my amendment and no on this horrific bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming.
I think it's very clear why we are doing this bill, and that is to protect women and girls in sports. I do not believe that this amendment is germane to the underlying bill. The very purpose of the bill is to state that these organizations cannot allow men to participate in girls' athletics. If the author of this amendment would like to bring her own standalone bill, I think that that is a more appropriate way to address this, but I do not believe that this amendment is germane to the underlying bill or the purpose of what we're doing.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady yields back. The ranking member is recognized.
Can you get any sense out of the film?
Listen, well, I will. It's a slippery slope what we're doing, but I yield to Ms. Hagman.
So all of those were videos that I'm actually very surprised that my colleague on the other side isn't fully aware of those particular videos. They've been showed over and over and over again in a variety of media. And I guess that if you have not seen those videos and are not aware of the circumstances where females have been injured by males in volleyball games, field hockey games, and those sorts of things, I guess that I'm surprised that you're saying that this is something that really isn't happening when you're now telling us that you're completely unaware of the incidents where, in fact, it has happened. And what this bill does, the way that this bill resolves that, is that that male volleyball player wouldn't have been on that court to hurt the female. That male would not have been in that basketball game to hurt the female. That male would not have been in the field hockey to hurt the female had this bill been in place.
Well, I'm aware that we want to protect young
Please let me finish.
athletes.
I have not yielded to you.
Well, I understand it's her
So
time.
what
Time
I'm
belongs to
saying
the
is-
gentlelady from Indiana, who's
from
yielded to
Indiana.
the gentlelady from Wyoming.
What I am saying is that this bill, by stating that it prohibits a person whose sex is male from participating in an amateur athletic competition that is designated for females, women, and girls, those incidents wouldn't have happened.
The time has expired.
Mr. Chairman?
What I'd like to do is adopt the amendment, and then we can keep the debate going. I mean, I think the debate is largely on the legislation, if the committee is comfortable with that. All those in favor of the amendment
Mr.
offered by the
Chairman?
gentlelady from,
I wanted to strike the last word.
you want to go on the amendment? Yes. Okay, then the gentlelady from California is recognized to speak on the amendment. That's got unanimous support.
Correct, and I want to yield to my colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Very kind.
That's fine.
I'm not sure of the unanimous support of the amendment, but I do want to clarify that members on this side of the aisle, not speaking for each and every one of them, clearly have as one of their operatives is to protect our children, to protect whether they are athletes or not athletes. The footage that was shown was enormously unclear. There was no language, there was no voice over, there was no print, etc. So let's move on from saying that we have no knowledge or no interest in protecting athletes. My question is, and it is still on the table, how 7187 in any way points to a solution to those acts if those acts occurred. Again, the film does not evidence that, but the point I want to make is that the proponent of the legislation has not answered the question of humanity, has not answered the question of whether or not the cost of discrimination is a higher cost to pay by this legislation than the problem that it's looking to solve. We've already heard from the gentlelady from Washington about what it may do to her daughter, an example of the trans community. I've already offered an amendment that evidences statistically the murders of trans women who happen to be African Americans. Does that legislation, though we're dealing with athletics, deal with the larger question? And there is no answer to that. And so if there is a question of male-female strength, again, she has no answer to that because Mr. Swalwell had a question, what is the mechanism of enforcement? Never has that been answered. What is the mechanism of enforcement? All you have, you're going to have condemnation. In cities, counties, hamlets, states across America, condemnation, interrogation, intimidation. That is what you're going to get. And you have no answer why this legislation should even be on the roster in the Judiciary Committee for us even to move forward. I've said this over and over again. So with that in mind, we have yielded. We will not, I assume you can get your own time. We have yielded for you to answer. None of those answers have been forthcoming. There's no enforcement mechanism at all.
Will you yield?
It is the gentlelady's from California's time.
Thank you. It would be up to the USOC in terms of compliance, but determining biological sex can be done with a cheek swab. It doesn't require a physical examination, as has so emotionally been described on the other side today. The other thing that I guess that I'm so terribly confused about is I don't think most people are confused about what is a boy and what is a girl and what is a man and what is a woman. I don't think that this is some kind of a mystery that we're incapable of figuring out.
The gentlelady yield to me.
No, I will not.
It's my time, and I reclaim my time and yield to the gentlelady from
You don't want my
Washington.
answers.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, please stop talking about how an emotional response from the other side is not appropriate. We are all human beings in this committee, and it is appropriate for us to have emotional responses about our children and a whole community of children that is listening to this and hurt by it. Secondly, I want to say to the sponsor of this bill, let's just take as given that you actually care about the rights of women and girls in sports. I'm just going to give that to you and say, all right, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Wouldn't you want to listen to what the Women's Sports Foundation says, what the National Women's Law Center says, what the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee says, what the International Olympic Committee says? I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this letter from the Women's Sports Foundation and the National Women's Law Center.
Without objection.
Let me just be clear. Contrary to its title, this bill does not protect girls and women's sports. Instead, it is a misguided and harmful measure that amounts to no more than a discriminatory attempt to target and exclude an already marginalized group of girls and women who are transgender, rather than addressing equity issues that girls and women face in sports. It goes on to say that the policies that ban girls and women who are transgender actually perpetuate harmful and dangerous stereotypes that lead to the policing and harassment of cisgender girls and women. Do you know what cisgender girls and women are? That is what you define as girls and women. And it is saying here, right here in this letter, that it is harmful. What you are doing is harmful to those girls and women that you claim to want to protect. Now, in addition, Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter...
My time has expired, so I need to reclaim it and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Generally yields back.
Anybody wants to claim time, I would love a little more.
We understand, I'm sure we'll get it, but I would like to deal with the amendment, and then we're going to continue the debate. So the question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman,
We just adopt the amendment, and then we'll come right back into the debate. It's not going to...
well, what I want to respond to something that she said on the amendment. So if I can just finish my point, I would really appreciate it.
Well, we'll recognize the ranking member to yield.
I will yield to the gentlelady from Washington.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Additionally, Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter outlines that the practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have access to the practice of sport. And by imposing a categorical ban on women and girls who are transgender, this directly conflicts with the International Olympic Committee's framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. And it goes on to say that actually, under the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act of 1978, the U.S. Olympic Committee is prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, age, sex, disability, or national origin regarding. For decades, federal courts that have interpreted these non-discrimination laws have overwhelmingly recognized that anti-trans discrimination relies on sex stereotypes and is a form of sex discrimination. So when the gentlelady who's the sponsor of this bill tries to say that this is actually something that is supportive of women and girls, and all of a sudden the other side has decided they want to be supportive of women and girls, I would ask you to look at what the organizations that actually represent women and girls in sports say. They do not say that this is helpful at all. And my colleague, Mr. Swalwell from California, is absolutely right.
Will you yield?
Not right now, because I am in the middle, it's Mr. Nadler's time, but I am in the middle of making a very important point, which is not only is Mr. Swalwell right, and I tried to make these arguments earlier, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people that you are trying to criminalize, essentially, make feel like they don't belong in our country. Not only is that true, it's not a thing, but on top of that, even if we were to take at face value that you care about women and girls, and I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that in my emotional state as a mother of a trans daughter. I'm willing to give you the right to say, all right, I care about this. Even then, why don't you listen to the National Sports Foundation that deals with sports for women and girls and what is good inclusive policy? That is what we should be doing here. And please stop talking about my emotional response to your bill. Yeah, it's emotional because you know what? There are Republican, independent, and Democratic parents out there of trans kids. I know because I did a roundtable, a bipartisan roundtable with our former colleague, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, about this issue. People don't want this ridiculousness, and it is deeply hurtful and harmful to our kids. Now, maybe you don't have a trans kid. Maybe nobody on this committee has a trans kid. I don't know. I think I'm the only one. But why don't you start to think about what this feels like to kids and parents across the country when you use the kind of language that you do, that is not even based in any kind of science. And so when you argue so righteously that you actually care about women and girls, why don't you start to look at what would actually make a difference for women and girls? Like more money so that we could make sure that women and girls programs are really thriving, like equal pay for athletes so that they can pursue their careers. Those are the things that make a difference.
Reclaiming
This does not. I yield back to the...
Reclaiming my time, I just want to point out, the bill, I agree with everything the gentlelady said, obviously, but the bill, the gentlelady keeps talking about males competing against females. The bill defines a male as, male means an individual who has, had, will have, or would have, but for developmental or genetic anomaly, historical accident, the reproductive system that at some point produces, transports, and fertilizes sperm for fertilization. Would have, does not have, but would have. But for a developmental or genetic anomaly. In other words, the fact is that there are people, a tiny number of people, we call them transgender, who are not males, who may have an X and a Y chromosome, but are not males. They're a different category. They're transgender. And this bill, by seeking to characterize them as males and say that they somehow unfairly compete with females, discriminates against them. And we heard about the tiny number. The governor of Utah said there were four transgender people in sports and one, on a women's team. Why are we seeking to humiliate and prohibit from participation in sports this tiny number of people who are not, in fact, males? We have to realize that humanity is not, as we thought for a long time, divided into only two sexes. There are more than two. Tiny numbers, but more than two. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, a statement from the sponsor of the legislation will be included in the record. The question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. I assume Ms. Dean wants her second amendment? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon is recognized.
Thank you. I do have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report. Gentleman from Florida reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized to explain her amendment.
Okay, thank you. I want to be clear here. This bill, H.R. 7187, is not about supporting and protecting women or females, as the bill would define them. As several of my colleagues have pointed out, the rationale for this bill and many of the comments we've heard from the other side of the aisle elevates cynical and dangerous political attacks on the transgender community. Everyone deserves the opportunity to play sports, to be part of a team, to have fun, and to learn resilience while challenging themselves. House Republicans have already voted to keep trans girls and women off their school sports teams. Now they want to jam through a bill to prevent trans girls and women of all ages and all levels from participating in sports. The fact is that there are real issues facing female athletes, but as usual, our Republican colleagues are missing the mark. Where's the discussion of legitimate barriers like lack of resources, vulnerability to abuse, bias, and wage gaps? I find it outrageous that this majority is yet again using the House Judiciary Committee to fearmonger and bully members of the trans community, a group of already marginalized citizens who just want to fit in and be included. When I was growing up, Title IX was in its infancy, but we knew the purpose of that law was to make everyone welcome and included in sports, an experience that has taught every member of my family valuable lessons that we still use today. Whether in school or elsewhere, we should not retreat from policies that promote the inclusion of all Americans, whether in athletics, employment, academics, housing, or all aspects of our civic life. I understand that the proponents of this bill say that they want to protect women and girls, but as multiple members have pointed out, this bill does so at the cost of marginalizing and harming individuals in our transgender community. That's what this bill is about, exclusion and fear-mongering. Meanwhile, the policies that American people and American women in particular actually want continue to be ignored or attacked. Now, this bill, as written, defines a female as an individual who has had or will have the reproductive system that at some point produces, transports, and utilizes eggs for fertilization. Very handmaiden kind of definition there. This bill mimics bills that have been brought in several states, which have sought to narrowly define the terms male and female while ignoring science and facts regarding sex and gender, particularly for the transgender population. Actual scientific research shows that it's more complicated than just male or female. Sex chromosomes can indicate one thing, anatomy can indicate something else, and other genetic factors can play a role. We know that our Republican colleagues aren't open to considering the rights and facts regarding our transgender citizens, and they've refused to withdraw this bill from the markup. So, since this bill purports to define women by their reproductive systems, I think it only makes sense that we do talk about reproductive health care here today, because we can't talk about women's equality for female athletes or others in the workplace without talking about access to reproductive health care. That's why I'm offering an amendment to this bill to prohibit amateur sports organizations from discriminating against anyone for being pregnant or accessing reproductive health care, including abortion care, contraception, or IVF. And that would include not only athletes, but also the coaches, administrators, and staff of these organizations. Since the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, states across the country have moved to restrict access to reproductive health care in a variety of ways, including banning abortion care, IVF, and certain forms of contraception. The consequences have been devastating, as providers have been forced to relocate and close their doors. And American women have found themselves in dangerous situations as they've struggled to find appropriate care. In the face of that reality, we need to make sure that the athletes and staff working at these organizations aren't discriminated against for accessing needed health care. If my Republican colleagues really wanted to support women, they'd support this amendment and ensure that female athletes and all women have the freedom to make their own personal health care decisions. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The point of order withdrawn. Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, this amendment has nothing to do with the bill that is before this body. Talking about abortion and contraception and reproductive health care services has nothing to do with protecting girls and women's sports and athletics. If you want to come up with and introduce a bill directed to this, you're more than welcome to, but it has nothing to do with the debate we're having today. I also want to say I'm really tired of the other side personally attacking us and impugning our character and accusing us of all kinds of nefarious deeds simply because we do not adopt your radical gender ideology. It was only about 5 minutes ago that everyone in this room would have been able to define a woman and a man. It was only about 5 minutes ago that every woman in this room would have been horrified by the idea that Title IX would be used to allow men to compete against women in athletics. It was only about 5 minutes ago that we recognized that there are biological differences between men and women with very, very limited changes to that, very limited exceptions. This amendment is absolutely unnecessary for the purpose of the bill, which is to protect women and girls in athletics. And in terms of the public sentiment on this, public sentiment is not on your side. The American people do not believe that boys and men should be competing against girls and women. The Washington Post survey from April 2023, 66% of Americans do not think that biological males should be allowed to compete in women's sports competitions at the high school level, and 65% of Americans do not believe that biological males should compete in women's sports at the college or professional level. A Gallup poll released in June 2023 found that 69% of Americans believe that athletes should only be allowed to play on sports teams that match their biological sex, which actually increased since 2021. Nobody is saying that someone who believes that they are transgender cannot compete in athletics. They simply have to compete with the same biological sex of who they are. If someone is transgender and is capable of making it to the Olympics, they are free to compete in the Olympics. But if they are a man, they should compete in the men's category, and if they are women, they should compete in the women's category. This bill doesn't do anything other than that. It just simply states that men should not be competing against women. That's all it does. And as a woman, I take great offense to anybody who believes that I do not sincerely want to protect women and girls in athletics, in the safety of their own homes, in their jobs, in employment, and in every other category. This amendment is unnecessary, and I would urge my colleagues.
Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it's absolutely absurd that we are considering this report today to hold Mark Swanitzer, President Biden's ghostwriter, in contempt of Congress. My Republican colleagues have already tried to obtain records of the special counsel's interviews with the president from the administration, and the Department of Justice has already given this committee substantial information. The administration has also been clear with my Republican colleagues that they need to engage with the executive branch on this issue. The main story here, Mr. Chairman, is that there really is no story. Special Counsel Hur engaged in an extensive and independent investigation. Mr. Hur found insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that President Biden willfully retained any classified materials. Moreover, Mr. Hur found insufficient evidence of any criminal wrongdoing and concluded that no charges were warranted. The special counsel noted 11 separate times in this report that he declined to prosecute the president. This is in stark contrast to Donald Trump, who was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, becoming the first president in 234 years of our history to be indicted. We have already wasted committee time on a hearing on this report from the special counsel. My Republican colleagues have already issued a subpoena to Attorney General Garland on this matter and held him in contempt of Congress because they didn't get audio recordings on top of the information that DOJ did provide. And now my Republican colleagues are going after a private citizen, a journalist and an author of 40 years. He has never been in the public eye, and I'm disappointed that this is how my colleagues have decided to use our time today. This is nothing but a distraction from the fact that my Republican colleagues have nothing to show for controlling the House. The Republican-controlled House is on track to be among the least productive in the history of this country. In the first half of this Congress, the House only passed 27 bills that became law, even though my Republican colleagues held 724 votes. As some of my colleagues on the other side themselves have said, they have nothing to run on, and it is embarrassing. When Democrats controlled the House and the Senate last Congress, we had one of the most productive Congresses, signing 365 bills into law. We passed transformational legislation that is continuing to make a difference in people's lives, to lower the cost of prescription drugs, cap the cost of insulin at $35, and make historical investments to fight climate change and build a green economy. To date, the infrastructure law that most of my Republican colleagues did not vote for has injected over $54 billion, billion with a B, into 56,000 projects in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Projects that are improving and strengthening roads and bridges and funding zero-emission transportation to improve air quality for Americans across the country. But that's not the story my Republican colleagues want to tell, especially today as President Biden, who helps advance and sign these historic investments into law, whose leadership was so phenomenal on investing in America, investing in people, building an economy from the middle out and the bottom up. Tonight is the night that President Biden debates Donald Trump. So instead, my Republican colleagues are using their position in Congress to bully a private citizen, to distract from their own shortcomings and the legal troubles of their candidate who has been convicted. First former U.S. president to ever have that dubious distinction. That's the real story here. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Lady yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Lady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Director Wray. Political violence of any kind is dangerous, unlawful, and totally unacceptable. Just as we all watched and then unequivocally condemned the attempted assassination attempt on our former president, I wish that we could all come together to unequivocally condemn the act of political violence on January 6th instead of defending props that were used that were harmful, dangerous props of gallows, attempting to show what people wanted to do to Vice President Pence. Extremists attempted to subvert our democracy in the worst assault on the U.S. Capitol since the War of 1812. Many of us were trapped in the gallery that day. We feared we would not make it out. Insurrectionists were chasing down former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and then Vice President Mike Pence. And I myself have been the direct target of political violence when an armed man with a gun showed up at my door, threatened me and my family, and we actually ended up having to move our home. So I understand the increased tenor of political violence that is racking our country. It has been on the rise, fomented by violent and dehumanizing rhetoric from top public officials, including the former president and members of Congress, sadly, and bolstered by the proliferation of easily accessible guns, including assault-style weapons. All of this violence is unacceptable, and I wholeheartedly condemn it. I just hope we condemn all of the violence, not just one or two incidents. Mr. Wray, today I want to focus on the role of the FBI and the need for the Bureau to remain politically neutral and independent. The FBI cannot and should not be subject to the whims of any president. The majority apparently doesn't think that the FBI needs to be politically neutral and independent. They want an FBI subordinate to the president, not accountable to the American people. That is one part of a larger plan to undermine our democracy, to remove the checks and balances that have protected us, and ultimately to subvert our freedoms. That agenda, promulgated by the former president, his loyalists, and their MAGA allies, is called Project 2025. It is publicly available online. I encourage everyone who's watching this to Google it. It includes plans to undermine every part of our government, including the FBI. Trump's Project 2025 agenda says that the director of the FBI must not be independent of politics, but instead must do whatever the president orders. Under Trump's Project 2025, Trump loyalists would undermine the non-political and independent structure of the FBI. Project 2025 openly calls on the next conservative administration to support, quote, a vast expansion of the number of political appointees in every office across the DOJ, especially the FBI. And so, Mr. Wray, given your extensive experience as a law enforcement professional at DOJ across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, why do you think it's important that the FBI maintain political independence from the president?
I think the FBI is and needs to stay independent, and that means protecting the American people without fear or favor, upholding the Constitution and the rule of law, and it means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. And I add that last part because the essence of independence and objectivity is not that an investigation is going to always yield the result you want. Our independence and objectivity can't only be respected when you like the outcome. That's the very essence of objectivity. Sometimes you're going to like the result, sometimes you're not going to like the result. And that applies to everyone, including us. Any number of times we're disappointed and frustrated by the results of our investigations. But the alternative is an erosion of the rule of law, where the only thing that distinguishes one investigation from another is power. And that's what you see in some of authoritarian countries around the world. So I'm not familiar with this particular
No, I didn't ask you to
Project
comment on that.
2025
No,
thing. I don't
know
know anything about it, but what I can tell you is, from my perspective, the FBI needs to be functioning as independent. Doesn't
Thank
mean
you.
it's not part of the executive branch. It doesn't mean the FBI director doesn't serve at the pleasure of the president, but it does mean that the way we do our work
has to be objective.
has to be independent.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question about the role of attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel. How do we protect that work?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The role, what role do the attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel play in ensuring that the Bureau respects the constitutional rights of American citizens? How do we protect that work?
So in my experience, the lawyers in the Office of General Counsel play an incredibly important role in ensuring that our agents have their questions about how to comply with the law and conducting their work answered, and ensuring that we conduct our work in the right way, which means scrupulously adhering to the laws and the rules that apply to us.
I just wanted to say before I yield, Mr. Chairman, that the Project 2025 also eliminates the FBI's Office of General Counsel in-house lawyers who are responsible for that role. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.